This tutorial gives you an idea of the type of exclusive tutorials I have available on my Patreon membership. Let's get started. I've sketched out the dandelion with an HB pencil and I have masked out all the light and white areas with masking fluid, and I'm going to allow that to dry naturally. So I'm mixing up colours for the background now my masking fluid is dry. So this is a little bit of cadmium yellow pale. So it's quite a milky wash consistency. I'm using raw sienna mixed with that cadmium yellow pale there, so it's slightly warmer colour. You can use a little bit of red if you want to. So I'm now mixing up the yellow with a little bit of the phthalo blue. You can use Prussian blue, and it's quite a milky consistency as well. I'm mixing up the same two colours here, but I'm going to add some more yellow to it. So you've got a yellow green and then you've got a green at the bottom. This is a dark blue green to the side here in the middle of my palette. So I've started off with that yellow green, the yellow and the phthalo blue, and I've added more phthalo blue just to make it darker and slightly thicker. So I'm wetting the background now. I'm not wetting the stem, but I'm wetting everything else using my 1-inch flat brush, but use a large soft haired brush and really take your time. Allow the water to soak into the membranes of the paper. It will give you longer to paint when you start applying your washes. So I'm starting with the yellow first of all, wet in wet at the top, and this is where the light is. So you may even want to leave a few gaps there of just white paper so it looks like the sunlight coming through. So this is the yellow with the raw sienna, so it's slightly warmer. I'm just painting it underneath that yellow. Now the yellow green, applying that now, going through the dandelion, through the negative shapes there where I haven't masked out, so it's quite yellow green on the photograph. So I'm applying a little bit more of that yellow green now, really loading my brush, working my way down. I've decided to use the yellow with the raw sienna here over some of the leaves, so to make sure that I've got my light there. I don't want to put too much green because I'm going to be working on those later, wet on dry. So working my way down with this yellow green, going past the stem because the stem is dry, so I've not actually painted or wet that, and using a little bit more of the yellow green there at the bottom, and just being careful there just to sort of paint right up to the stem. Just finishing off with that yellow green, and now I'm loading my brush with the green, so it's a little bit more phthalo blue in there. It's a lovely limey green colour though, isn't it? Just painting this now damp into wet, so the paper is still quite wet, but the paint, as you can see, isn't running as much. You can see those brush marks, but they're soft, and I want to create the look of foliage in the background. I'm just tilting there. You can see things are still running down just to get things moving a little, and going back in with some of that yellow green there just around the edge of the dandelion, but also in those gaps where I haven't masked out, and a touch of wet and wet there on the foliage there beneath the dandelion. Just a few more marks. So take your time with this. You know, I'm looking at all the marks and leaves in the background. Obviously there's a lot of bokeh effect there, but a little bit more of that green, damp into damp now in the foreground area, so it comes forward and it kind of makes it look more 3D. And still using my flat 1-inch brush, nice large brush for this big background. I've added a little bit more phthalo blue to that green colour there, slightly thicker, and I'm just painting this damp into damp, this darker green. Now I forgot that I'd already mixed some, so I've mixed some more, not to worry. And I'm going to mix some even more now, so just added a little bit more of that phthalo blue, and I squeeze my tube paints into the pans there, so it's really quite creamy paint this, painting this damp into damp just to really create the dark there in the foreground, also tilting to get things moving so they look kind of like grasses and foliage in the foreground there, which is quite nice to do. So what I'm going to do now is sprinkle some sea salt. You can use table salt onto the damp surface, mostly around the top of the dandelion, just to create some nice sort of light areas, a little bit of sparkle and magic. So I'm going to let that dry naturally. And what I'm also going to do is just apply a little bit more of that light green just at the top there. I felt that if I'd left it with that very yellow colour, when I remove the masking fluid, the background would be too light and there wouldn't be enough contrast between the dandelion, which would be very light, against the very light background. It wouldn't stand out. So I'm applying that sort of light green there and then blending that away with a clean damp brush so I don't get any hard edges. I'm also lifting off a little bit there just to make sure I've got my light at the top with the paper towel. I've mixed a little bit of that dark green into the light green there to make a bit of a mid green, painting this wet into wet here. I'm not worried about backgrounds, but just want to get a little bit more of some darker tonal values here in the centre of the dandelion, again to create contrast, and painting around the left side there, damp into damp with my size 6 brush, taking off that excess fluid so I don't get any backgrounds. Mind you, looking back now, a background may have looked like a dandelion in the background, who knows? But I'm blending again with a clean damp brush so I don't get any hard edges there. So make sure your brush is damp and not too wet. Now I'm going to allow my painting to dry naturally to enable the salt to work. And as you can see there, it's worked quite nicely, creating some light textured marks. So I'm mixing up some colours here for the tips of the leaves, starting with burnt sienna. And I've added a touch of phthalo blue, but it wasn't quite the right colour. So I'm adding a touch more red, painting this wet on dry with my size 6 brush. Rinse my brush there and I'm just pushing in a little bit of water there, diluting that colour but also creating a soft edge at the top of that mark, adding a touch more water, and it creates quite a nice effect there. I want it to be even warmer, so I've added some more of the red there, painting wet on dry again with my size 6 brush, just the tips of the leaves there coming down, rinsing my brush now, and I'm going to do the same thing, pushing the water down into that mark that I've made to dilute it and soften the top part of that mark. So I'm continuing on here, painting more tips. So decide how many you want to paint, because sometimes the watercolour dries too quickly. So you may want to just paint a couple and then dilute and soften, up to you. See what works best for you. What you don't want to do is have it dry too quickly and then you're sort of scrubbing the mark. So again, I'm just rinsing my brush and just pushing clean water down towards the red paint there. So I'm loading my brush with that light green, yellow green paint there and painting some of the light yellow leaves there, wet on dry with my size 6 round brush. Again, take your time, look for the lightest leaves and paint them. And I'm just using some water to soften there at the top. And I'm just going to pick out again another light leaf, wet on dry, rinse my brush. Instead of taking it off on the paper towel, I just wipe it on the side of the pot so the brush has more water on it to sort of dilute and blend. So I'm just dipping my brush into the yellow with the touch of raw sienna and painting that wet on dry as well. So just working on all the sort of light areas, light green areas here. So I'm going back into that dark green, that's the phthalo blue with the yellow. I'm painting wet on dry some of the dark greens now. I really wanted to just focus on just painting 1 or 2 layers rather than building up, because sometimes you can lose your light that way. So still using the size 6 brush, painting wet on dry, and I'm adding a little bit of darks here, some water, so dilute some of the areas, but it's incredibly dark in this area here. Loading my brush again, just sort of picking out the different areas. There's quite a lot of masking just above this as well, so you're in no danger of losing your light there. But I'm just sort of working my way round, really thinking about where these darks are, taking my time, rinsing my brush now, and I'm just softening and lightening that sort of dark there just at the bottom as it sort of meets the very lighter area going into the leaves below there. So just taking my time and just pulling down some of that sort of more mid-green there into the lighter green. Now this is a very, very dark green. It is Paynes grey in with the phthalo blue and the yellow, but you could, if you had run out of your phthalo blue and yellow, you could just mix up Paynes grey with yellow, and I'm painting that damp into wet. I've mixed up some raw sienna pretty much on its own, quite watery, and I'm just painting a first layer on the stem there with my size 6 brush, working wet on dry. And I'm just using a little bit of that burnt sienna and red mix and dropping that in wet there just to warm up the center part of the stem. I decided to mix up some burnt umber as well and drop that in right in the centre just to darken up that tonal value a little bit. This is all wet into wet. And now I'm mixing up some ultramarine with a little bit of burnt sienna there to make a dark brown, and I'm painting that wet into wet, working my way up to the top of the stem. I'm going to allow my painting to dry once more. And what I'm doing now is I'm going to work on the background using my circle stencil, and I'm going to use the bokeh effect. And I'm using a natural sponge, but you can use one of those magic sponges as well that you use for household decorating to get paint marks off the wall. That's quite good for getting watercolour off. You can use a stencil brush as well, or a hoghair brush, to work the paint off as well. Because watercolour isn't permanent, you can actually remove the paint. As you can see, that's exactly what I'm doing here, and it's working quite nicely with my natural sponge. And you notice I actually use the paper towel to get rid of any excess water and paint as well. Now, you don't have to do this technique. You could actually just leave the background with the salt effect and keep everything really kind of simple. And it's a really nice painting to do this because the stages are really nice and simple. But I quite like the bokeh effect, and I haven't done it for a while, so it's fun to do. And I've put loads in the foreground, varying the size of the circles, etc. And I'm going to allow my painting to dry before I lift off all of the background paint. So the painting is thoroughly dry, and as you can see, I'm removing the masking fluid. And I'm using the sticky side of some framing tape to do this. You can use a paper towel to remove it, or even some masking fluid or a putty rubber. But look at that, it really does make the dandelion stand out, and I'm glad that I went back in to create some more dark around the edges there. So what I'm doing now is I've mixed up some ultramarine and burnt umber. It is very, very dilute. And I'm going to paint wet on dry some of these very sort of light shadow colours here. And just sort of painting them in little sort of vertical marks here, varying the sort of length of them. But I want to keep a lot of the white as well. One of the dangers of painting white flowers, any white object actually, is you lose your white. I've got carried away sometimes, and I've just painted over all the area that I've masked out. So I'm just giving you a gentle warning that that could happen. So you almost want to exaggerate the white. So you need this in here to create some of these little shadows, but remember, less is more. So just finishing off the marks there, giving you a close up here. I'm using a damp brush just to soften this hard dark edge here as it goes into the light of the dandelion, and dropping in a little bit of raw sienna there as well, and blending and softening just to create sort of more of an earthy yellow colour there, and just sort of bringing this colour into some of the white of the dandelion. And there's a little bit of raw sienna here mixed with the burnt umber, and I'm just painting thin, light, pale lines here just for some more details. Going back in with that raw sienna, touch of burnt umber, painting very long, thin lines here to create some more details coming from the centre of the dandelion out again. Again, wet on dry, rinsing my brush here, just getting some of that light green, that yellow green, so it's the yellow with the phthalo blue, and just painting some of the negative spaces here. Perhaps I used too much masking fluid, so you can add a few more of the sort of light green background here and there, just to sort of build up that detail to make the dandelion look more 3D, bring it to life. I'm using some of the dark green now. That was the Paynes grey with the yellow. I'm painting this damp into damp. I'm using my size 6 round brush and just sort of injecting these darks in here, sort of to make the dandelion look more 3D. I've taken off the excess paint, as you saw there, and I'm painting some of the darks on the leaves now, wet on dry, using that dark green paint. Loading my brush more, I've added a touch of yellow there, take the excess on my paper towel there to give me some control. And this is a slightly sort of mid to dark green here. I felt the other one was a little bit too dark. Painting this sort of dark mark, wet on dry, rinsing my brush, taking the excess off on the paper towel, and again blending and softening there, rinsing my brush again just to pale all that so I don't have a hard edge, and you can graduate that colour from dark to light. Dipping my brush into the yellow and the raw sienna there, painting that really lovely yellow colour, getting a touch of the light green, mixed a bit of dark in there to make a mid green, and dropping that in wet just around the edges there. So I'm really varying my sort of colours, the light, the mid and the dark green, but also the tonal values. The dark green obviously will give you a very dark tonal value where the shadows are. So again, sort of using this mid green, working wet on dry, and still using my size 6 brush there. And if you look at the photograph, there's quite a lot of detail here. So take your time, really have a look at especially where the mid and darks are. We've painted a lot of the lights already in the first stage. This is very dark here. It bled a little bit. And again, that's where I should have taken the excess off on the paper towel. You can see how you can lose the control. But I'm painting a little bit of the light green here and just working my way along, sort of looking for the darks, the mid and the light greens. If you want, you could actually let your painting dry, paint mid tonal values on first, let it dry and then go in with your darks. I'm doing a little bit of wet in wet and letting things bleed in so they look a bit softer. But if you want things to be a little bit more realistic, almost a bit tighter, it might be a nice idea to allow it to dry between stages. I actually added a touch of that dark green, the Paynes grey with the yellow, into some of that sort of red colour there that I used previously to paint these tips. And I'm just painting this darker sort of brown colour on the edge. You could just use something like burnt umber mixed with some Paynes grey for that as well. And it really does pull that dandelion away from the background. So I'm just using a very sort of pale yellow here to paint some light washes on the foliage here. I'm using some mid green now, and I am painting pretty much damp into damp with my size 6 brush, some of the gaps of the dandelion, and that sort of more mid to dark green will bring out the light and white of the dandelion as well. It's easy to overdo this, so remember, less is more. The most important thing here is the white of the paper. It's the star of the show. So I'm adding a touch of that dark green there, the Paynes grey mixed with the yellow, wet on dry at the centre, and just sort of finessing and softening with the tip of my brush to create some of these darks here. Again, it really makes the lights look lighter. So your focal point really is the white of the dandelion there. So you want to put your darkest dark against your lightest light to bring out your focal point. So I am mixing up here some of the phthalo blue with a touch of the burnt sienna. And I'm adding a touch more of that phthalo blue, and I'm just painting wet on dry the centre of the stem. Just added some water there, it was a little bit dark, and I'm just sort of softening a little bit through the centre there, so you've got a bit of a shadow going through the centre. This is a little bit more of the red mixed with the burnt sienna to really make the tips of those leaves there pop. Adding a touch of that dark green to that burnt sienna, taking the excess paint off, and I'm just painting very thin lines here, pretty much wet on dry. The painting has dried off a bit. You don't want these to bleed, so if you're worried, do dry your painting first. But this little bit of detail here kind of brings the dandelion to life. I'm sort of working my way from the middle outwards using that sort of dark green mix with the burnt sienna. I've mixed up here some burnt umber again with the ultramarine. It's slightly darker than that sort of light shadow colour I used before, and I just wanted to add a few more little darks just on top of some of the areas that I painted before, just to darken them up a little bit. I felt some of my circles that I used the masking fluid with were a little bit hard edged, so I'm just using my little eradicator brush, which is a small synthetic brush, and I'm softening the edges with clean water and then lifting off with the paper towel. So you could use a stencil brush, or even a sort of an old synthetic brush would work quite well to do this, just to soften those edges, and then again obviously lift off with a paper towel. So it's a good time now to allow my painting to dry. And what I am doing is I'm rubbing out any pencil lines that are visible from the drawing, especially because I've lifted off the masking fluid. There were a few marks there and it just cleans everything up. Do make sure your painting is dry if you do this, because you don't want to smudge the paint if it's anyway damp. Again, I'm going back into those tips. They're just not dark enough still. So I'm just darkening a few of them here and there just to really pull that dandelion away from the background so it looks more 3D. And of course, I'm finishing off with a little spatter. So using white gouache, I've got a touch of water in there. And I'm just spattering on top of the dandelion and around the edges as well, just to create a little bit of light and sparkle. And just to say, if you wanted to, you could actually paint some of the bouquet circles with white gouache as well. Kind of watered down a little bit, so you've still got a bit of transparency there, but it's quite a nice way of creating the bouquet effect. And of course, I am varying the size of those circles, painting some smaller ones, mid-sized ones, and of course some larger ones. And I'm concentrating mainly in the foreground area. I want to leave the background above the dandelion a lot more softer so it creates depth. So I'm removing my washi tape now, and it reveals a lovely white border. And what I like about this, it gives me a chance to assess to see if I need to do any more to my painting. But I think I'll leave it there for now. So I really hope you enjoyed this exclusive dandelion tutorial, and it gives you an idea of the type of tutorials that I have available exclusively on my Patreon membership. Here are all my exclusive tutorials. I've got a variety of different subjects and lots of learning levels, including beginner and improver. So I really hope this tutorial has given you an insight into my Patreon membership and the type of tutorials that I have available on there. If you would like to support the tutorials that I publish here on YouTube, why not think about joining my Patreon membership? More details about the membership can be found in the description below. Thank you so much for watching. Bye for now.